All right, today we're starting on chapter 5, social interaction in everyday life. And we're going to learn about statuses and roles today. But before we do that, let's look at the opening of the chapter. I want you to look at the photo at the opening of the chapter, and you'll see that it's a bunch of young people with everybody with their faces down looking at their cell phones. And I really want you to try and understand. I know it's difficult for all of you being so young, what a new phenomenon that is. Um, it's just incredibly new. And I remember when I first noticed that you could be in a restaurant, and which is a place where people went to talk with each other and meet and communicate and have fun, have an enjoyable meal, etc. historically. And you would have two people sitting at a table across from each other and be on their cell phones, not communicating with each other at all. So that's a new form of social interaction. And it's changed a lot of things in all of our lives, that particular thing. Another thing that's at the top of the chapter before we actually start it is that research into what drives people nuts on an airplane the most with social interaction with people, and it has to do with people who don't control their children, people who talk too loud, play music too loud, and take too many overhead bins, people who get drunk and become disruptive, which we see increasingly, don't we, with airplane travel. Um, so it's interesting to see what pushes people's buttons, to put it in the vernacular, when you cross the bounds of the norms of social interaction. What types of things bother people the most? And then I want you to think about this scale question, those little scales at the beginning of every chapter with the question. The question in this one is, what do you think? And then the statement is, I spend more time on social media than I do talking face to face with family and friends. And you can rate that on a scale. And just for your own knowledge, and be honest with yourself. See what you think about that. Okay, so all of those examples uh, from the photo of the people on their cell phones, the research about the airplane behavior, and the question in the questionnaire are examples of social interaction, which is just acting toward others and reacting to people around you, and vice versa, how they act towards you and react towards you. And it's so powerful because it shapes our actions. It makes life orderly and predictable because there are norms involved. And if we didn't have those norms of behavior and ways to interact, then life would be random and unpredictable and chaotic, which can be very nervous making. If you don't know how someone's going to react, have some idea or what appropriate behavior is, and someone's acting inappropriately, it makes one very nervous, sometimes frightened. It depends on the situation. The thing about the social structure and the norms that go along with them is that we're not really aware of them that much until they're broached, and then we become quite aware of them. Um, they also can be formal or informal. They can be written down. They can be laws in some cases, as we've talked about previously, but a lot of them are very informal. And it's when they're violated that we really notice what's going on. And that's and as I said, sometimes that can just make you angry. It can throw you off balance. It can be frightening. It really depends on the situation. So every society has some form of social structure, um, and is primarily in this interpersonal way of behaving and publicly is statuses and roles and groups and organizations and institutions, which those norms and appropriate social interactions relate to. However, in this chapter, we're going to study the institutions and organizations later in the text. We're just looking at human social interaction in this chapter. And so the first thing to understand is something called statuses. So a status is a social position that you occupy, or one occupies in society. So they often have labels that go with them: a doctor, a lawyer, a teacher, a mother, a son. You know, you could go on and on and on. The labels: a musician. I'm some now examples from the text. A musician, a voter, a sibling, a friend. Those are all statuses, and we all inhabit, as you can tell from that list, many statuses. So one of the things that's important to understand, though, is that in sociology, one status is not more important. Your status as a mother is not any more important than your status as a CEO, and vice versa. Okay, they're all positions. They're all on an equal plane of statuses. Okay, in terms of importance. And what that means, let me put this in, is in terms of value. Now, it's true that society places more importance, right, on different statuses. But from a sociological perspective, they are all positions that you hold, and you've got to manage them. Well, that comes up later in the chapter. How do you work with all of these different positions in society? So the reason that one position is not more important than another is because they're all important in that they determine our social identity, who we are to others, and also how we feel about ourselves and who we are to ourselves as well. But they are a way of identifying who and what we are to other people. So what's a status set? A status set is a group of those. I mentioned a couple of them to you that you occupy at any given time. They change through our life. Okay, you're not a mother or father till you are. You're not a married person until you are. You're not a college graduate until you graduate and get a diploma. So that before those things happened, you were not whole. You were not did not have those status sets. But once you do, then you do have them. They're relational and complementary. What that means is they're connected to other statuses. Statuses are interconnected. So let's think about a family and just stick with the traditional, typical, old-fashioned father, mother, child, or children. Okay. They're all statuses, but they're all relational with each other, and they're all connected to each other. And so no matter how many you have, a key to status sets are that they're all linked to other people. They're linked to your family and your family. They're linked to your coworkers in your place of employment. They're linked to your fellow students if you're in a school, that type of thing. And those connections influence our behavior and our relationships. So there's two kinds: ascribed and achieved statuses. Ascribed statuses, if you think about those two words, ascribed means you didn't have any choice in it. The society or others are saying this is what you are. Achieved is our statuses that you created for yourself, in a sense. So an ascribed status is a social position that a person is born into. You can't control it, and you generally can't change it. Did put an exception in here for gender, but no matter what choices you make about gender, when you were born, you were, 99% of people are either male or female babies. I know there are some exceptions to that anatomically. Okay, so things like sex, age, race, ethnicity, those types of things, family relationships. Are you a brother? Are you a sister? Are you a son? Are you a daughter? Those are all ascribed statuses. You can't do a damn thing about them. Okay? And you probably, most often, don't really want to. So the example that the book gives of an ascribed status is a male Latino brother. Okay? Now, an achieved status, we've talked about this already. I gave you some examples, is a position that you attain for yourself through your personal effort or you assume voluntarily. So I've given plenty of those examples, but your book graduate, mother, employee, that type of thing. So the thing about achieved statuses is that's kind of nice about them is that they can be controlled to a certain extent. They can be changed, right? You can do something like going to college to get a better job. That would be an achieved status. It requires a degree. You can choose not 100%, but to a great extent, what you're going to be achieving in life, unlike ascribed statuses. Now, I used to put up on the board, a list of ascribed statuses, and what goes on both sides, can go on both sides, I should say, of achieved statuses. The social class of your parents is an achieved status. The religion that you grew up in, if you grew up in one, ascribed status. The social class of your parents is an ascribed status, as is the religion that you grew up in. However, those two things can be changed, right? You can be born into a poor family and become a multimillionaire. Okay, that's an achieved status. You can be born as a Catholic or a Protestant or a Hindu or a Muslim, practice that as a child, you have no choice, ascribe, and then reject it all or change the religion when you grow up. That's achieved, okay? The reason those two are on both, can be either or, is first of all, most people do not statistically move from whatever to a great degree, what the social class was of their family or the religion, especially they tend to move more with the social class than the religion. But the reason that they're ascribed as well as can be achieved and changed is because they have such a powerful effect on us, such a powerful influence on who we are. Because during that time we were in that situation, particularly growing up in that family, those were ascribed statuses. Okay, you were a poor little girl of a certain religion, or that type of thing, going to school, and that affected your sense of self and being. What's status? Okay. Oh, here's the other thing: is a master status. Okay, the master status that you are overrides all other statuses and forms, and it's a very powerful part of a person's social identity. So often it's, you can't change your race. You can pass, as people used to do, um, for in certain cases, but you're generally race, ethnicity, age. I can't be identified as somebody who's 20 years old. My ascribed status is an older woman, an older white woman, right? Except I'm half Armenian and half, so, but see, there you can get away with a little bit of wiggle room, right? Because my name is not Armenian. I don't particularly look Armenian. So it's a very interesting thing to think about these ascribed statuses. If you tweak things a little bit, there are ways around if you want them to be. I didn't choose to do that, by the way. It turns out that way. And so the master status are things that, you're always going to be identified as a woman or whatever gender you have chosen. You always are going to be identified as by skin color, unfortunately, but that tends to be how it is. Those become your master statuses to a great extent. Those are the ascribed ones, but there are also achieved master statuses. I would say that my master status is a professor. It was so interesting when I went to Italy because I really saw the respect They call me Dr. Teresa, and were very respectful when they asked what I did, and I told them. Um, that was a really powerful master status, probably more in that culture than in ours, even. So it's often an occupation. A doctor, that's often their master status, that type of thing. So those are achieved. And then you've got status inconsistency, right? And that's the conflict that arises from you occupying social positions that are ranked differently. So the one your book gives you is a teacher who also works as a bartender. It's kind of like, what? That just doesn't relate. Um, and so there are many others, that uh, are very confusing to lots of people. Um, there are a couple of things that have happened with very well-known, wealthy, highly respected Black men who've been arrested for doing something that the police thought was suspicious. One was trying to get into his own home in Washington, D.C. Henry Louis Gates, famously, professor, written many, many books, et cetera, was trying to get into his own house in Georgetown, which is one of the fanciest neighborhoods in Washington, D.C. A neighbor, and it couldn't have been a very close neighbor because they would have known it was Henry Louis Gates unless they just saw a black man from behind and didn't recognize him. Who knows? Anyway, called the police, and the police really, gave him a rough time. Um, Even though he had identification, he was dressed for his professional life, very beautifully dressed with a leather briefcase and had all the ID you want. Um, and a very well-known person, but he was just a black man trying to get into, walking around a house trying to find an open door or window, and made those assumptions. So there's status inconsistency for you. That often happens, as we know, with people of color. Um, so what's okay within a status? There are things called roles. Okay, and the role is the behavior that's expected of a person who holds a particular status. So we occupy a status, but we play a role within that status. And so the interesting thing about a role is, as you might imagine, if you've ever done any theater, it's dynamic. Um, it's the moving part of a status, the dynamic, the piece that we play the part of that, of professor or student or doctor, lawyer, whatever. Um, and within a role, there are formal and informal behaviors. So you can occupy one status, college student. Your behavior in a classroom is very different than your behavior, I'm sure, in the dorms or hanging out with people or your friends or whatever. The other thing about roles is that they're relational. Like statuses are relational. You're always in relationship with someone or something. Um, and so there are role requirements that govern what you're doing when and with whom. Okay. They're based on mutual obligations. I have an obligation to you in my role as professor. You have an obligation to me in your role as student, especially if we're in a classroom situation. You always have, roles as a student with an online class as well of things you have to do. But in terms of our relational connection, as I'm sure you know, it's very different in a classroom than it is this way. So we have obligations to one another within our roles, and we have that as parents, as employees, that whole situation. So that role performance is what is termed the actual way that we occupy a status. So it's how we're expected to behave in a particular status. Um, and there's lots of variations on how people do it. Some people do it well, some people don't, depending on the, good employee, good parent, bad parent. Those are playing roles. They're all playing roles. Some doing the appropriate way, some not. And then the difference in that is role performance. Okay. So the actual behavior of the person is our role performance, and that determines whether we're doing it well or not so well. Now, just like we have status sets, we have role sets. You'd have to, right? If you have a bunch of statuses, then you have to have a bunch of different roles you're playing. So some of you you work, your parents, you may be a single parent, which is another role, and you're going to school, you have adult parents that you may have to do some caregiving with or managing with if you're an adult returning student. There are enormous, you have friends, you may belong to a club or an organization. Those are examples of role sets. Now, as you might imagine, within that, you're going to get role strain and role conflict. Any of us who have been working parents know about role, either strain or conflict, depending on, that's actually conflict, because that's two different roles in, head on with each other. You got to work overtime, but your kid's really important performance or game is happening at the same time. That's role conflict. And role strain is when there's difficulty within the role, within the same role. So you might have several exams on the same day, as they point out. We try and avoid that by having a final schedule, but that's for finals. You might have 2 midterms on the same day if you're in class time. There might be extracurricular activities that you are involved in as a student that conflict with your role as a student. So that you're a student in both of them, right? I see that with student athletes all the time when we were in classroom. Mrs. Alexander, I'm going to be gone next week on blah, blah, blah for such a game. And I know we have a test scheduled for that day. Can I take it? That type of thing. That's the same role, student, but there's a strain there. You're a student athlete and you're an academic student within that role. How do you cope with role strain and role conflict? Because it could get intense. It can. And many people in America are suffering from that right, on a daily basis. It can produce tension, hostility, aggression, and all kinds of stress-related disorders like insomnia and that chronic fatigue syndrome, all of that. So some of that strain and conflict can be short-lived, but some of it is long-lived. If you have to work for a a very stressful job for years and years and years, and it's not paying you enough money, and you're a parent and all of that, can you see what's going on there? I'm sure some of you, unfortunately, are experiencing that. I have in my life, and I know what kind of strain and stress, depending on whether it was 2 roles conflicting or 1 role conflicting. So there's one of the ways people deal with it is by denying that there's a problem. And so often employed moms, the example in the book, and this is really true, become super moms. Okay, I tried to become a super wife and a super mom at one point in my professional career before I became a professor. And man, I look back on those days and it was nuts. It really was. Trying to manage all of that and be perfect at everything. So I was denying that I couldn't do it all. But there are some effective ways to deal with conflict and strain, and your book lists them all. You can do some compromise and negotiation to try and get more help, try and delegate more. You can compartmentalize your roles, and you can read the rest of these and see what to do. So now we're going to move into the sociological theories of social interaction. And the first one is symbolic interactionism. And this one is, I just love symbolic interactionism for this particular idea of social interaction that we're studying. Uh, Symbolic interactionism is really what they say is that how significant all communication, that people understand that all communication is contextual, okay? That has to be taken into account, how important the context is. How you speak, even the language you use, will vary. It's called code switching from one situation to another, one person you're talking to or another, one environment you're in or another. And so one of the examples they give you is that if a friend or a doctor ask, how are you? You're going to have different responses, and the question has a different meaning, doesn't it? If a friend says, hey, how you doing? Or the doctor says, how are you? How you doing? Right? So what the next important thing to understand is such a great concept. It's called the social construction of reality. And I think we talked about this earlier on at some point in some lecture. The idea of the social construction of reality, if you think about the words, the social, creating, construction of reality, basically what it means, I'll give you the formal definition and then I'll give you mine, okay? Human reality is socially constructed reality. We produce, interpret, and share the reality of everyday life with others. The shorthand version of it is what we think is reality is what has been made or created for us. I think two amazing examples of that are, number one is daylight savings time, which we're going to go flip off of in November. It's totally created reality. It has nothing to do with how the sun rises or sets or the planets or anything else. It was created during wartime, so there were more daylight hours for people to work. And some states have it and some states don't. Like Arizona doesn't have daylight savings time. It's on the same time all year. So my sister lives in Arizona, so I have to always calculate when I'm calling. But next month at exactly this time of day, remember you fall back in the fall. So what is it now? It's 10:24 a.m. while I'm doing this. Okay, it will be 9:24 a.m. in a month at exactly this same time, the way the sky is, the way the sun is, everything else. Now, can you say, well, I'm not going to honor that because it isn't real? It's socially constructed. No, our whole society's built on it. You'd be late for work or early for work, or you'd miss classes, a whole variety of other things. You can't do it. You've got to follow along. Another example is our money, which is totally, well, not totally, but virtually worthless. A dollar bill, the silk paper and the incredibly expensive inks that it's printed on the silk paper is worth more, costs more than the dollar bill. When we went off the gold standard in, just before the Second War, I think it was 38 or 39, 1938 or 39, there used to be gold to back up every kind of paper circulating in the United States. And the coins were the value that they were because they were solid nickel or solid silver in the terms of quarters and dimes. Now you can look and see the copper that's between them now, the layers of the covering of the silver. And so they're almost worthless. In class, I always wished I could burn, $100 bill or something to prove it. Never had the money, and also I'd set off the fire alarms. But once again, can you say the money's worthless and I'm not going to pay you your rent or whatever? No, of course not. You can't. But it's a socially constructed reality that there's value to these pieces of paper or the coins. Get my point? Okay. So, those things that we're told that we operate on as reality, may or may not be. It depends on what your definition of reality is. We'll get to that, okay? So I would love you to take the double speak quiz that's on page 89, because double speak is really a powerful concept. So it's typically through face-to-face interaction that we use this kind of weird terminology that's called doublespeak, but it's also television, social media, that type of thing. So the doublespeak quiz, let's just look at two of the air support. Well, that sounds nice. What that means is, of course, bombing, right? And what about alternative fact? Well, what that really is lying, a lie. So there, take the rest of the test. I think you'll be interested. But I've mentioned before in the lecture how uh, words like changing the Affordable Care Act to Obamacare. Now that's the opposite kind of it. It's not really doublespeak. It's making something sound worse than it is. It's kind of the opposite of doublespeak, where bombing, air support sounds better than bombing. Another amazing example of doublespeak. Military has tons of it. If any of you have been in the military, which I'm sure you have, you're very aware of this. One of them is friendly fire. That's doublespeak. What does friendly fire mean? It means one of your buddies killed somebody else in the company, another buddy, okay? Accidentally, 99% of the time it's an accident. But, you're not going to knock on a mother's door and say that's what happened. You're going to use the term friendly fire because it's sounds better, kinder, and gentle. Now, you can make something sound worse to turn people against it, as I've once again used so many times, and probably will again with the Obamacare versus the Affordable Health Care Act. But another example of that is the inheritance tax. When in the George W. Bush administration, when they wanted to lower the rate of inheritance tax that had to be paid when someone died, which didn't start until, you had at least $1 million estate or something of that nature. They wanted to do polling to see where Americans were at with this and prove that they had the support of American people to lower taxes on the wealthy for inheritance taxes. They called it the death tax. Okay. Well, if somebody asked you if you should have to pay death taxes when, grandma dies and her old Edsel in the garage you're going to inherit, you would say no. Well, you wouldn't, but that, as I said, didn't start till $1 million or something anyway. So you see, this is so important right now. Pay attention to language, okay, because it's manipulated often. And that doublespeak is one of the ways it gets. It makes the bad seem good and the good seem bad and that type of thing. And so, there are many ways to do doublespeak. The common ones are euphemisms, which is what friendly fire is, as an example. You can get bureaucratese, gobbledygook, big words and long sentences that people don't understand. And then inflated language, where it makes everything seem really complex or worse than they are, or a conspiracy or something. That's inflated language. Okay. And so now we're going to move to social interaction and self-fulfilling prophecies. Self-fulfilling prophecies is another very powerful concept in sociology and symbolic interactionism. Basically, what symbolic interactionism says is if you believe something to be real, this is the Thomas theorem, if you believe something to be real, the consequences will be real. So, and that's where the term self-fulfilling prophecy comes from, that type of thing. So our perceptions of reality shape our behavior in many ways. So if you define situations as real, they're real in their consequences, is the way the Thomas theorem actually reads. Our behavior is a result of how we interpret a situation. Okay. And, Robert Merton's example of the self-fulfilling prophecy in the book is teachers turning young people off to any kind of athletic endeavor by telling them they're klutzes and they're terrible at this and that particular thing. And so what happens is they become that. They become the club because they avoid all physical activity and they never learn how to use their bodies, and et cetera, et cetera. Um, the other thing is fear. You can interpret a situation as being scary that isn't, and create some really bad outcomes by that. That happens with policing a lot. The self-fulfilling prophecy of black man in a car, bad, Uh, whereas, as recently happened, the black man in the car was a paraplegic and could not get out of the car himself. Sure, you saw that happening. So that was a self-fulfilling prophecy on the part of the police when they make assumptions. You believe something to be true. So if our perceptions of reality shape our behavior, how do people define reality? Well, there's two ways that researchers have looked at this. One is ethnomethodology. Ethno is a group of people, methodology is a method, okay? So that it's the study of how people construct and learn and share their definitions of reality, and that make everyday interactions possible. We have to have some common reality to have effective interactions with one another. And that's what we see collapsing right now. We don't have those shared definitions in the way we used to have as a society. So one of the things is we base our interactions on common assumptions about what makes sense in specific situations. Those common assumptions are what are deteriorating. Okay, we do this in two ways. One, we do it by observation and conversation. We learn the rules of, how we interact and that type of thing. And the second way is we can also learn those common assumptions if we break the rules. So when we violate rules, there are consequences for that, right? An example of that is elevator behavior, and it comes up later in the chapter, but I might as well talk about it here because it says when rules are violated, we're sanctioned. So a sociology professor, famously, and now sociology professors do this all over the country, said to his students, first of all, let's start with how did you learn elevator behavior? You learned it, remember, we learned through observation primarily. Okay. I doubt your parents ever sat you down and said, honey, you're old enough now, we need to have a conversation about, and you're going, oh my God. And then they say elevator behavior. So here's what you do so you don't embarrass yourself. When you walk into an elevator, you go as far back and as far away. If there's someone else in the elevator, you keep as much distance between you as you can. You kind of go to your corners. No eye contact. You don't communicate except to say, if you're near the buttons to push for the floor, you ask what floor somebody's going to, just came in. Otherwise, you say what floor you're going to, and you stand facing forward quietly till you get to your floor. Okay, that's elevator behavior. We all do it. We all behave that way. So what the sociologist did was he had his students go in, face forward, not turn around, and get real close to people and start yakking at them. And in one case, several people in the elevator actually took that student down, put him on the floor in a restraining post till they got landed. And even though he was saying, I'm just doing an experiment, it didn't matter. It scared people. Well, understandably. There has to be an understanding of what the common behavior is if you're going to be locked in a box, tiny box with total strangers, even for a few minutes. Okay. So that's how we learn those things. And that's what happens if we break those rules. Okay. So that's methodology. The other research method that we use that symbolic interactions uses is called symbolic interactionism. Oh, I'm sorry, that symbolic interaction is called dramaturgical analysis. And I think I mentioned this last week, dramaturgy. That's Irving Goffman. And what you do is you look at social interactions as if they're occurring on a stage and that people are playing parts and roles, about that. So what we do with those roles is something called impression management. We talked about this last week as well. You kind of suppress unfavorable traits and you stress favorable ones. in your presentation of self. You rely on props to convey, your particular image. And so, for one thing, see my diploma up there? One of my diplomas. I don't know. So we display diplomas if we have them. Doctors do that. Academics do that. Favorable other things that we may display to show our worth to a certain extent, and that we are who we say we are. Um, and there's also what's called front stage and backstage behavior. Okay. So, the way we schlep around the house and look when no one's around is that's backstage behavior. Front stage behavior is how we behave when we're out in public. And in certain situations, some things are more appropriate than another. So, the social exchange theory. Now we're moving on from the symbolic interactionist, which was ethnomethodology and dramaturgy. We're going to look at social exchange theory. This is where we say, we don't do it consciously necessarily, but what can I give to get a benefit? Where is the dynamic between this situation or this person where there's something to receive and something to give? It's you receive a reward, and if you receive a reward, you're more likely, to repeat an action or a behavior than if you receive a sanction, right? We can go back to the elevator behavior again, or criticism or disapproval. So people have tangible and intangible assets that they can trade in a relationship, right? We're not necessarily conscious that we're doing this, but the kinds of tangible and intangible assets we have are attractiveness, money, intelligence, status, youth, power, affection. People like to be liked, right? So can you see the tangible and intangible aspects? So any resources can be traded for more or better resources. Now, how many times have you seen a really weird looking older man, totally unattractive? I could name a few, but I'll restrain myself. Just not attractive at all, and very old, weird, but with a gorgeous young woman, trophy wife, right? What's the trade-off? What do you think the trade-off is? Well, it's money and power for beauty, right? For a trophy wife, it's really called trophy wives, right? So that's a very crass but common example, and one you can see all the time. And so they're not necessarily consciously thinking that way. That doesn't mean everybody's thinking that way. But, there are characteristics, for instance, in several generation or two ago, being a good wife meant that you could cook, you could sew, you'd be a good mom, you could, you're reasonably attractive, you could, that type of thing. So that was an asset you brought to the marriage market if you had those things and could do those things. Man was a good provider, right? Would be a good dad, all of those things. You see that social exchange theory. Once again, no one is consciously generally sitting down and writing a list. It just happens. Okay. So as if you can see this situation, one of the things they bring up is that some of these, negotiations, if you want to call them that, are deliberate, but most are passive, and can be also based on long-term negative interactions. And they bring up the abuse of women in a situation, and how, domestic violence research shows that women stay in abusive relationships because their self-esteem is gone after years of being in and abusive relationships growing up with parents and spouse, and a parent saying, or a friend or somebody, in the family, you'll be lucky if he marries you, that type of thing. And they feel like they have, here's the key in this exchange, social exchange here, they feel like they have nothing to offer, right? So if you have nothing to offer, then and if any of you have ever felt this way, then you know, or known anyone who feels this way, then you know where I'm coming from. Then you accept almost anything in exchange of behavior towards you. The feminist theories talk a lot about the cultural norms and gender role expectations that shape our interaction and patterns. So, women generally talk about their feelings more. Men are socialized to be more dominant and take charge. Women often ask questions to find out about feelings. Questions like, were you glad that happened, or were you sad that happened? We're more likely to do what's called maintenance work with uh, uh, relationships and conversations, being very supportive, or trying to get people to communicate a little bit more. And this is a thing that drives me nuts, and it's a thing now with the younger generation. I just found this out. Women, and it's taught in communications courses and sociology courses. I don't know about psych, but probably, that women do something called uptalk, where every sentence ends with a rise of inflection at the end of it. Um, my name is Jennifer, is the example I give them. Well, is it Jennifer or not? Right? That's a question, not a statement. When you do that rising inflection. Well, my granddaughter, who's 14, she was here visiting, and she does it every sentence, and it was driving me nuts. I didn't talk to her about it, but I did talk to my son about it, her uncle, and he said, "Oh, Mom, that's something it's called something, you probably know what it is, and I don't remember, but that's something they're all doing now." And it's so disturbing because it has been a female way of communicating for generations that people try and get females out of doing, because it makes you so, there's no statement of fact. My name is Jennifer. My name is Jennifer. You get the difference there? Okay. So that's one of those things. Men's speech tends to reflect conversational dominance. So they speak more frequently for longer periods of time, often interrupting or ignoring others, interpreting others' meaning, changing the topic, giving unwanted advice. That's a very, very funny comedy skits about that. A woman comes home and says, "My job was horrible," and she just wants to talk. And today, and he says, "Why don't you quit?" And what she wants to do is process it and communicate about it. Mansplaining, it even has a term now in culture for that type of thing. The key point with the feminist theories, that's all not innate. That's not hardwired in our genes as males or females. It's because we've learned how we are supposed to be in relationships and communication as males and females. That's changing dramatically, but that's pretty much how it was. So there are all kinds of ways that we do this communication. And there's a long list of nonverbal communication. And as I'm sure you're aware of them, silence is one. The silent treatment, we have a term for that, right? There's visual clues, smiling, frowning, that type of thing. Gestures, leaning forward shows interest, pulling, this kind of behavior, you see these guys in power doing this all the time, is a very defensive way of being. And shrugging your shoulders is indifference, that type of thing. So then there's facial expressions, which can reveal emotion, but they can be deceptive because they don't always show our feelings because we learn to control and mask them. uh, from messages we've gotten about social interaction. Parents saying, "Don't roll your eyes at me." So we learn not to do that, even though we may feel like rolling our eyes at somebody. Or, look happy when this auntie that you can't stand, gives you this big smoochy hug. And you're told as a child to look happy. So we often learn to monitor those facial expressions. Um, the other thing about faces is that they can lie about feelings. You can tell when people are lying by uh, avoiding eye contact, blinking, swallowing frequently, those types of things. Third, expressions can be misleading because of cultural variations. So the assumptions about Americans or the feelings about Americans, German business people think that Americans are excessively friendly, and that means that they're hiding their true feelings by grinning and smiling all the time. In Japan, it's rude to display negative feelings in public. So the Japanese tend to smile more in public than than Americans do. And the only consistent findings across all cultures is that women tend to smile more than men, and that men are more likely to mistake smiles and friendliness for being flirtatious. Okay, that's across all cultures. What about eye contact? That can tell us a lot. Staring means you're angry, eyes wide open and looking at somebody interested. Cast down, maybe ashamed and sad. And then appropriate eye contact really depends on the social context. We are told, I hope you're told and know this, that for job interviews, you sit up straight and you look the interviewer in the eye. You don't talk mumbling, looking down, et cetera, et cetera. Managers, even once you're hired, expect eye contact from subordinates, but subordinates often interpret managers' eye contact as being hostile if it's too prolonged eye contact. What about touch? Well, it can be positive and it can be negative. Okay, we know that. Gendered touching. Uh, it depends on the situation and one's gender. So as you saw, in higher ed, there's been a lot of research done on that. When female faculty touch male students on the arm while talking to them, it's perceived as friendly. But when the reverse, with a male faculty touching a female student on the arm, they often get somewhat afraid or nervous because they're afraid it may escalate. So gender touching can be very, very tricky. Generally, women are more likely than men uh, um, to initiate hugs and touches for support, affection, and comfort. Men are more likely to touch to show power and sexual interest. What about cross-cultural variations in touching? Um, there are a lot. Let's just put it that way. The U.S. is a medium touch culture, more than Japan. Less than Eastern European cultures. Our personal space varies from culture to culture. Um, we're more annoyed by airline passengers who invade space in the seat, 47%, then skimpy legroom, 39%, then long security lines, etc. We don't like people invading our space. And when personal space is violated, we get very often very upset. The elevator example is one. In a communications class I had years and years ago when I was in school, the professor had us do an experiment with a student who was the stooge and didn't know was going to happen. Whoever came in late and last to class. And what she would do is set it up so that she would say, I want you two to go up there in front and just have a conversation. And then we'll analyze the conversation, talk about anything you want to talk about. But the student who knew what was going on would get closer and closer and closer into this other person's space by their face, just talking to them. And the person who didn't know what was going on would keep the conversation going, but would back up. And so the other person would move forward until finally the stooge, would bump into the wall in one case. And then they got it. It was interesting to see the light bulb go off and they realized what was going on. We don't like people invading our personal space. Our personal space for our personal, private space for people that we know and care about, friends, family, partners, that type of thing. Is around Intimate space, it's called. It's 2 feet or less. You know, you can start at 2 feet and move in. But we don't like other people that don't know us getting much closer than that at all. And it's around 6 feet for people we don't know, 4 feet, I guess, maybe. It just depends on the situation and how formal it is. And you're not going to get any closer than 12 to 20 feet in public situations, especially. The more well known someone is, the more powerful they are, the more personal space that they have. Space and power are very, and they often have people protecting them around them, right? To be sure that nobody gets too close. So space and power are connected in terms of who has privilege and status and wealth. Think about giant houses, giant yachts, right? Um, so giant cars, offices, all of those things. And where that next comes into social relationships is that some very wealthy and powerful men feel um, uh, very entitled to invade women's space. We've certainly had a lot of examples of that in recent years, and finally people getting busted for doing it, of just assuming you can grab them wherever you want and however you want, and a variety of things because you have wealth and power and you're male. Okay, what about cross-cultural variations in space? We tend to stand in line. A lot of other cultures don't. The French don't. Most Middle Eastern countries, people don't stand in line. In Middle Eastern countries, you'll find men walking down the streets holding hands with each other, but you never do it with a female. And it looks weird to our eyes, and what we do looks weird to their eyes. So the last part of this chapter is about different aspects of the internet and social media. So let's just do a little bit of this, not much. I'm sure you know how I feel about social media. The internet is a wonderful tool if you know how to use it, right? You have to know which sources are valid and are not. Why anybody would ever get their news off social media? Think what social media means and then think about news. They're two separate, completely, in journalism, they're two completely different things. So that's an issue. But virtually everybody's on the internet now, as you know, and has access to it. Um, and so we're still learning how to use it, how to operate it, how it affects our social interactions with each other, and where the barriers are, where the boundaries are, how to use it in a positive way, how to not get addicted to it, which is so sad, especially with children. So that is a huge influence in our social interaction now, although it's, here's the difference, it's virtual social interaction. And I'm once again just referring to social media primarily here. Uh, the internet as a tool is fantastic, but I wish there were classes that taught people how to use it in an appropriate way and go to valid sites and that type of thing. But I guess that we'll just have to see how this all comes out in the future with what this Pandora's box we've opened with access to the internet and social media. So that's it for this chapter. Thank you.